It seems it was inevitable. She and I began to drift away from each other a long time ago. After 10 years of marriage, our relationship became ordinary. She was no longer the one I married, and I probably changed too. It wasn't that I stopped loving her, it was that we had changed in different directions. The events that took place only widened the gap between us. In the beginning, everything worked out just fine for us. Young, in love, with an active, intimate life and common interests. She was so attractive at that time. My friends said so did I, but she had everything you could ever dream of. Perhaps life has become too simple for her, and she has stopped taking care of herself. Getting up late, being overweight, having a different mindset, lack of interest in how I was progressing in my career. She even seemed to resent my success. You see, I was always the center of attention. I played guitar in a popular band, performing in top clubs 6 days a week. Attention from women was an inevitable part of it, but I always resisted the temptations. I succeeded in this for a long time. Of course, there were innocent flirtations, but that was where it all ended. Over time, the tension grew. With Sarah's new attitude towards life, something like this was bound to happen sooner or later. The three other members of the group, Derek, John, and Ross, sometimes had their own affairs. They somehow hid it from their wives, but I don't know how. We didn't really discuss it in the group. It was kind of an unspoken rule. There were always jokes and comments about the women we met at performances, but it all remained in the shadows. I've been playing with these guys for a few years now, and we didn't have to talk about what was going on behind the scenes. For me, it all started with Shelley. She was married, but she never brought her husband when she came to our performances. She danced with other men and socialized with her friends in bars. The rest of the group said they had kissed her in the past, but didn't say if there was anything else. I wasn't particularly interested in that. All I knew was that she was incredibly hot. Long, dark, curly hair, perfect breasts, and a toned figure, which she emphasized with tight jeans and high heels. She always flirted with me when Sarah wasn't around, and I knew something might happen. I watched her on the dance floor, and when our eyes met, she winked at me and began to move even more seductively. She squatted slightly, squirmed, looking at me with parted lips, as if to say, "We both know where this is going." If I looked at her long enough, she would make an offended expression on her face, narrow her eyes, and her wet tongue would lick those luxurious lips. Yes, it seemed inevitable. When Sarah came to the group's performances, Shelley behaved very reservedly. They even talked and sometimes danced together. It turned me on even more, Shelley's flirting with me in Sarah's absence and her friendliness in her presence. This greatly fueled my desires. Even more exciting was the fact that she was married and was probably returning home to her husband, who suspected nothing. It all started on Saturday evening after our performance at a local club. Sarah was with us, but she didn't want to wait while we packed the equipment, so she went home. Shelley stayed at the bar to drink and watch us get ready. In the small dressing room behind the stage, I was sorting out the equipment when she entered. She came up to me, lightly grabbed a lock of hair, and whispered, "You know, Jim, you and I need to have a nightcap sometime." Our faces came closer, and I whispered, almost touching her lips, "Honey, I think we could get into a lot of trouble if we do this." She smiled and whispered, "I can handle troubles. And you?" Our lips touched, and we kissed lightly.
You're delicious.
She whispered. I knew we would come to this. "We need to meet in a more private setting. Do you agree?" "Of course, dear. The question is different. Will you be ready?" She laughed quietly. "Shelley, we can't do this here. I need to go home. They are waiting for me, and I cannot linger. How about next Friday? You could come to the club a couple hours early and meet me in the Holiday Inn parking lot. We'll rent a room and get to know each other better." "Okay, Jim. I have some things to do in the morning, but I'll finish everything and come, and then we will move on to other things." "Do you have any business to take care of, Jim?" "Honey, I think that you and I will solve all the problems that may arise." "Great, dear, because I have a very serious matter, and only you can deal with him," she answered with a flirtatious laugh. "I can't wait, honey. See you there." "See you, Jim," she said, giving me one last long, passionate kiss and leaving. This week seemed endlessly long. I couldn't stop thinking about Shelley and got excited at the thought of her leaving her husband at home and meeting me at the motel. At 36 years old, and after 10 years of marriage to the same woman, the prospect of enjoying another, new woman made me literally lose my mind. Shelley was my age, and I think her thoughts were going in the same direction. I fantasized about having sex with her. Sarah acted as cold as always all week, and was just annoyed that I was so distracted. And all the time I thought, if you knew what your friend and I would be doing behind your back this Friday. And I waited. Finally, Friday evening arrived. I arrived at the motel early, rented a room, and waited for her in the parking lot. When Shelley arrived at the appointed time and got out of the car, I could hardly contain myself. Her gorgeous hair was beautifully styled, a smile was shining on her face, and her clothes only fueled my desire. A short black skirt that barely reached her knees emphasized her slender, graceful legs. Black, high-heeled shoes and a tight-fitting blouse emphasized her magnificent breasts. The skirt hugged her figure so tightly that it was impossible not to admire her charms. "How handsome are you? Need some company? Maybe there are things that need to be settled," she said with her signature chuckle. "I think you and I need to talk alone." "Shall we pass? Didn't you take your husband with you?" I asked. She giggled again, and we hugged and went up to the second floor of my room. Along the way, she gently pressed against me, nibbling my neck while I tried to cope with the door lock. As soon as we were inside, we had sex. "You knew I needed it, didn't you?" I smiled. I think we both knew it. When we finished, we cleaned up and Shelley got ready to head back to the club. Her smile was wide and content, and her eyes sparkled with happiness. She was flirting with Shelley, but now I knew her secret. "Don't worry, dear," she said as we were about to leave. "Your wife won't know anything. I'll just dance with her as usual, only we will know what happened before." Everything went off without a hitch that evening. Shelley looked as usual cheerful, flirty, relaxed. Sarah did not suspect anything, and Shelley from time to time gave me those same looks that made me boil inside. I felt like this was just the beginning. Now I realized that once I tried it, it would be impossible to stop. After the night at the club passed, I realized that I was starting to feel different. 10 years of marriage, monotony, lack of passion, all this began to weigh on me more than I thought. Shelley opened a door for me that I couldn't close. I didn't feel guilty, on the contrary, I felt excitement and a taste of freedom. Now I knew I wanted more. Our connection with Shelley, her passion, her willingness to take risks, it all stirred my feelings. I didn't think about stopping our meetings. Moreover, I began to think about other women who had been in my life all this time. Holly came to mind first. She and her husband, Jack, lived in our area. Sarah and I were friends with them as couples, sometimes meeting for dinner, and Holly often came to the club to hear our band play. Her husband, Jack, was a self-confident, constantly boastful businessman who loved to talk about himself. He liked to remind everyone that he could have any young woman if he wanted. This has always annoyed me. Unlike Jack, I preferred women my own age, especially someone like Holly. Holly was the complete opposite of her husband's sweet, caring, but at the same time incredibly seductive. Her figure was simply perfect. She knew it and wasn't afraid to show it. When she worked in the garden or pottered around the house, she always wore short shorts and tight tank tops that showed off her curves. Sometimes she went out in the yard in a swimsuit. Her luxurious breasts, slender legs, and thin waist could not go unnoticed. Often, when I talked to her on the street, she seemed to purposely bend over so that I could look at her cleavage. Sometimes she went too far. When Holly came to the club, she used to put her arm around my neck during the break, pressing her chest against me. She even did it in front of Sarah, which I found both risky and incredibly exciting. I began to develop a plan. Jack was almost always busy at work, and Sarah liked to sleep until noon. I had every chance to spend time with Holly without the risk of being noticed. I decided to use the first opportune moment to push her towards something more. And such a moment has come. One sunny day, I saw her in the garden. She was on her knees, digging up weeds, her short white shorts and tight tank top making her even more desirable. Her hair was pulled back and her face was slightly stained with dirt. I walked over pretending I just wanted to say hello. "It's a bit hot for this kind of work, isn't it?" I said, standing at her gate. She raised her head, her face lit up with a smile. "Oh, hi, Jim," she said, brushing her hair back with the back of her hand as she turned to me, still on her knees. "What brings you here at this time?" I wanted to say, "I came to see if I have a chance with you," but I restrained myself. "Sarah is still sleeping. I was bored and thought maybe you had a cold beer," I answered instead. "Absolutely," she smiled joyfully. Her wide smile lit up her beautiful face, as if illuminating it with happiness. So far, everything was going as well as possible. "Come in, Jim. I was just about to take a break. I need to rest and cool down a bit," she added, clearly delighted by the unexpected visit. "Well, honey, don't cool down too much. I like you the way you are," I said jokingly, with a slight hint to see her reaction. Something in her mood changed. She blushed slightly, straightened her shirt, and answered quietly. "Well, Jim, maybe you should come by more often. Maybe you're just what this girl needs to relax every now and then." She winked at me, then stood up, and, to my surprise, leaned over to kiss me tenderly on the cheek. Her hand inadvertently touched my trousers. She took my hand, quickly looked around, and led me inside. I remembered our drummer Derek once saying that Holly kissed him in the back room of the club after she came to see the band perform. He said she was passionate, especially when she drank. Then she quickly apologized, but jokingly asked how she could get to know him better. He claimed that she pretended it was a joke, but he knew it wasn't. Once we were in the kitchen, she pointed to a high chair at the kitchen island, motioning for me to sit, while she walked over to the refrigerator. Leaning over the tabletop, she gave me the opportunity to enjoy the view. "What would you like, Jim?" "Well, have a drink, of course," she asked with a slight laugh. "Well, honey, what do you have?" "That is, to drink," I played along, trying to maintain a light mood. She smiled widely. "Darling, I can get you anything you want. Drink in the morning. Jack would never let me do this, but he's not here, as you can see. What Jack doesn't know won't hurt him. Sarah is the same, and I agree. What they don't know, they won't feel. So come on, honey. Just the two of us." She turned around, stood on her tiptoes to reach the bar shelf, and exposed a strip of skin on her back between her jeans and top. She seemed to know what kind of impression she was making and moved slowly, as if giving me the opportunity to savor the moment. I liked her courage. She poured us a shot of wild turkey and brought mine over for us to clink. "To best friends," she said as we drank. The whiskey quickly made itself felt, especially in the morning, on an empty stomach. I watched her arch her back, her incredible curves highlighted as she threw her head back and quickly knocked over the stack. I knew the alcohol would take effect quickly, so I said, "Holly, when you walk out into the garden with that dazzling smile, it's a wonder you don't stop traffic on the road." She laughed. Throwing her hands behind her head, she untied her hair, letting it fall over her shoulders, then ran her fingers through it, stretching her arms up and lifting her chest slightly. "Oh, I doubt anyone notices," she laughed. "Honey, all the guys here are probably staring at you in the garden. You're probably driving their wives crazy with jealousy," I added with a smile. She laughed again, her eyes sparkling. "And you, Jim? Have you ever lost your breath while looking at me there? HM." I realized she was teasing, and I liked it. Wild turkey definitely had an effect on me and even more on her. I assumed it wouldn't take much for her to make this moment unforgettable. To keep the mood up, I said, "Give me one more, dear, for all this sweet adventure." She laughed cheerfully, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Oh yes, I'll definitely drink that, and let it be a double portion." We quickly knocked over one more. The atmosphere was tense. A sense of anticipation was in the air. I liked this game, this flirtation, the slow build-up of tension. I saw in her eyes that she was ready to forget at least for a while and allow herself to enjoy the moment. I reached my hand down to her cleavage and slowly wiped away a stain of dirt from her gardening, moving leisurely and moving closer to her breasts. She leaned her head back and put her hand on my shoulder, then moved closer until our knees touched. She then lifted one leg, bent it at the knee, and placed it on the stool on which I was sitting. It was obvious that I was becoming tense, and she noticed this by raising her knee higher to rest against my body. So, Jim, you haven't answered me yet, honey. Have you ever had a hard time looking at me? Her gaze was playful, but frank. I carefully placed my hands on her waist, running my fingers along the waistband of her cut-off jeans, and answered quietly, I think you'll soon find out. I think we'll both learn a lot about each other today. What time will Jack be home? Not soon, Jim. We have time, she smiled. I let my fingers slide just below her waistband, and she, in turn, slowly unbuttoned my clothes. There was something provocative, but also playful in her actions. She kissed me tenderly and said, It's fun. Come on, Jim, let's find out what it's like, you and me. She whispered in my ear, How about it, Jim? Are you having fun? Her voice sounded gentle and a little mocking as she nibbled my earlobe. I smiled at her and reminded her, Holly, I still get goosebumps when I think about you. Jim, she replied, I'm trying my best. She stood in front of me, her gaze was decisive, and we both understood where everything was leading. The action developed as if there was some hidden tension between us that required resolution. We didn't just exchange phrases, each of them carried something more, hidden feelings and desires that could not be ignored. Holly showed her courage and determination, and I didn't stop when things went even further. So, Jack, my loving, cheating husband, take this. Her voice sounded quietly, but with such determination that I could hardly contain my surprise. This moment, her words, her confidence, all of it was filled with passion and something personal. Holly's words sounded like a challenge not only to me, but also to her past, her life with Jack. It was more than just physical interaction. This was the moment when she decided to do something that would change her, that would help her throw out the accumulated emotions and resentment. She enjoyed this feeling of freedom and power at the moment. She stopped to catch her breath, her gaze raised to me, and there was temptation and determination in her eyes. What do you think at this point, Jim? She asked, clearly knowing that I was stunned by what was happening. Do you think Sarah can do the same? Her laughter was filled with challenge, but also with some sadness hidden behind these words. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional release. We exchanged kisses, and every touch felt like a new discovery. Her arms wrapped around me, and at that moment I felt all the barriers disappear. Holly suggested moving into Jack's bedroom, and her determination to do it there, in his bed, was a kind of challenge to everything that had come before. I carried her into the bedroom, her legs wrapped around me. She bit my neck and laughed as we walked down the hallway. We fell onto the bed, and Holly, without letting go of me, pushed me to continue. Her determination, her passion, all this made her even more attractive and at the same time vulnerable. When it was all over, we lay next to each other, our bodies tired, but in a sense liberated. We knew that this was a moment that changed something inside both of us. Holly smiled at me, her gaze warm and grateful. Watch, Jim. A few hours left, she said, and I knew that this moment would remain with us forever, as something more than just a fleeting meeting. It was something real, filled with emotion and passion that cannot simply be forgotten. Holly, I think it's time for me to go, honey. Sarah will probably get up soon, and it's time for me to go home. She laughed at this and said, I think she will never know how good her husband was today. Give her a kiss for me, sweetie, and tell her how much I appreciate the loan her man extended this morning. I winked at her and got dressed as she sat on the bed with her knees pulled up to her chest and her arms wrapped around them, watching me get dressed. We'll have to do this business as usual, Jim. Now that I have it, I'm not sure I can live without it again. What do you think, sweetie? Holly, I think we should definitely do this every chance we get, love. You are a bad girl and need to be taken care of regularly. Say hi to Jack. She laughed. I left wondering how this would end. Will they be able to find out? Will Holly and I keep this going? Was I going to keep looking for other women? I was quite sure of the latter. It was too good to pass up now. More women was exactly what I needed and what I was going to strive for. And I mean ideal. Several weeks have passed. The connections with Shelley and Holly became part of my life, something of a secret adventure that I carefully guarded. On the outside, everything looked perfect, but inside I felt a strange mixture of excitement and anxiety. The feeling of danger only fueled the desire, but the alarming inner voice began to sound louder. Sarah remained just as cold and distant, but her behavior suddenly became a little suspicious. She no longer looked at me through her fingers, but seemed attentive. I noticed how she checked my phone, thinking that I didn't see it, and how she held her gaze a little longer when I returned late. Shelley, it seems, began to take our relationship more seriously than I expected. After another night at the motel, she whispered, "You know, Jim, I feel like there's something more between us. Maybe it's time to stop hiding." I almost choked on my beer. "Shelley, honey, you understand that this is impossible. We both have families. It's just a fun adventure, nothing more." She frowned, her gaze darkening. "You think this is just fun for me? Jim, there's a lot you don't understand." Her tone made me tense. And then there was Holly. Her flirting became more obvious. Her attention to me became more and more persistent. I began to catch the glances of my neighbors, to notice how Sarah was increasingly interested in our common, friendly meetings. One day, Jack, her husband, was unexpectedly at home when I came to Holly on the pretext of borrowing a garden tool. I felt his heavy gaze as we talked in the doorway. "You don't happen to drop in on my wife too often, Jim?" he said with a grin that had a hint of threat in it. "Just picking up the instrument, Jack," I replied, trying to sound calm. One evening, after the band's performance, an unpleasant surprise awaited me. Sarah unexpectedly came to the club, although she had rarely visited before. She was sitting at a table with Shelley. The two women were drinking wine, their laughter a little louder than usual. I felt a chill run down my spine. After the performance, Sarah came up to me. Her eyes were focused and her voice was calm, but with a slight hint of sarcasm. "You're not paying attention to me at all, Jim. Maybe it's time to fix this. How about dinner tomorrow?" I nodded, feeling that something was wrong. The next day at dinner, she unexpectedly laid her cards on the table. "Jim, it seems to me that we have long lost what made us a couple. But, I don't want to pretend that I don't notice anything anymore." "Who is she?" Her voice was sharp, but there was also pain in it. I froze. Sarah knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to begin to destroy the walls of my security. Sarah's words were like a bolt from the blue. I was confused, trying to come up with an excuse, but my head was blank. The only thing I managed to squeeze out was this pathetic, "What are you talking about, Sarah?" Her gaze became even harder, but a barely noticeable tremor appeared in it. "Don't make a fool of me, Jim. I'm not blind. I know you're cheating. And I have a guess as to who." Her words sounded like condemnation. I felt my heart clench. Shelley? Holly? Or does she know both? "Listen, Sarah," I began, trying to sound confident. "You're jumping to conclusions. Yes, we had problems in our marriage, but I would never." She interrupted me sharply. "Never. Jim, you're forgetting that I'm human too. I feel everything. I see everything. You have become different, cold, distant. I checked your correspondence, Jim. I saw the messages you sent to Shelley." These words were a blow. My attempt to hide something collapsed in an instant. I was silent, unable to figure out how to get out. "I thought maybe we could get back what we had. But it seems that you yourself have chosen what is more important to you," she continued, her voice as fragile as thin glass. At that moment, I knew I couldn't deny any more. I did what I thought was impossible. I destroyed our marriage. "Sarah, I'm sorry," I said, lowering my head. Her face was impenetrable, but there were tears in her eyes. "Sorry? Jim, sorry? Do you think this is enough? You destroyed everything we had. What do you suggest I do now?" "I don't know, Sarah. All I know is that we both deserve to be happy. If this means we can't be together, then. She rose from her chair, and her voice became icy. I'm not going to put up with this anymore. Do you want freedom? Great. You'll have plenty of freedom when I'm gone. These words sounded like the final point. I felt panic take over me. Sarah, wait. We can talk. We can fix everything. She turned to me with a bitter smile. No, Jim, you have already made your choice. Now it's my turn. She left the kitchen, leaving me alone. I remained sitting at the table, pondering the consequences of my actions. Something inside me broke. My life, which I had so carefully tried to divide into two parts, began to fall apart. Shelley and Holly now seemed less like a source of excitement and more like part of the problem. I felt like I had no control over anything anymore. But this thought soon gave way to another. What if this is freedom? The opportunity to start over, to be honest with yourself, with your desires. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I left everything behind. The group, the marriage, the duplicity. But before I had time to fully think it through, events began to unfold with renewed vigor. The next day, Shelley called me. Her voice was tense. Jim, we need to meet. It's urgent. I didn't know what she meant, but I felt like it could be bad. When we met in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, she looked excited. Did something happen? I asked, trying to hide my concern. Jim, Sarah knows, and not only her. What do you mean? She looked down. Holly told her husband. And Jack. He's angry. Very angry. My brain was trying to digest the information. Jack knew. It was worse than I could have imagined. Are you sure? Sure. Jim, he might do something. Dangerous. Now everything has become clear. My double bottom began to burst at the seams. There was chaos ahead, and I had to do something to save something from my life. But what exactly? Returning home, Jim noticed that the house seemed strangely quiet. Sarah didn't meet him in the hallway as usual, and there wasn't the usual sound of the TV in the background. As he walked past the living room, he noticed her suitcase standing by the door. His heart skipped a beat, and he felt like the world around him was slowly falling apart. Sarah, he called, but his voice sounded hoarse and uncertain. She emerged from the bedroom with a small backpack on her shoulder. Her face was calm, but pain and determination shone in her eyes. I'm leaving, Jim, she said simply, without resorting to long explanations. I can't live like this anymore. Wait, let's talk. Jim tried to approach her, but she took a step back, avoiding his gaze. No, Jim, it's too late. I can't trust you anymore. You not only betrayed me, you destroyed everything we built together. And what hurts most is that you didn't even realize how far you've gone. Her voice trembled, but she quickly controlled herself. I'm going to my parents. I need time to figure myself out, and I think we both need it. Jim stood there, not knowing what to say. He wanted to hold her. He wanted to explain that his actions didn't mean that he didn't love her, that it was all just a mistake that got out of control. But the words stuck in his throat because he knew. This was not just a mistake. It was a conscious decision, a choice he made again and again until he lost everything. When the door closed behind Sarah, Jim felt empty. The house, which previously seemed cozy and full of life, now became cold and lifeless. He sat down on the sofa, holding his head in his hands, trying to cope with the pain and the knowledge of what he had done. But that was just the beginning. The next day, Jack came to his house. Jack did not call or warn. He simply appeared on the threshold with a threatening expression on his face. His eyes were full of rage, and Jim realized that the conversation would not be peaceful. Did you think you could just mess around with my wife like that and get away with it? Jack began. His voice was quiet, but there was a threat in it. You ruined my marriage, Jim. You ruined my life. Now I will destroy yours. Jim tried to say something, but Jack pushed him sharply, forcing him to step back. You yourself chose this path. Now be prepared for the consequences. Jack looked at him as if he could kill him with one look. You will lose everything you have, and believe me, I will do everything to make this happen. After Jack left, Jim was left standing in the empty house, feeling the panic rising. He knew that Jack would not waste his words. Soon rumors began. His reputation within the group suffered, and the tension between the members became unbearable. Derek and Ross, who had previously turned a blind eye to his intrigues, now became cold and distant. They didn't want to be involved in his problems. They were afraid that it would ruin their own lives. Jim knew his time in the group was coming to an end when Derek told him bluntly, "We can't work with you anymore, Jim. You've done too much. It's not just your personal affairs anymore, it affects us all. You must leave." And now, just weeks after his double life became apparent, Jim was left with nothing. Sarah left, the band abandoned him, and Jack did everything he could to ruin his career. Jim lost all those connections that he considered unshakable. Now he was left alone in an empty house, without work, without friends, without support. He sat on the old sofa, listening to the silence surrounding him, and for the first time in his life, he felt real emptiness. Everything he had built, everything he was proud of, his career, his marriage, his friendships, everything was gone. And all because of his own decisions, because of his inability to appreciate what he had. Jim realized that his desire for new sensations, his thirst for freedom and selfishness, led him to the fact that he lost everything that really mattered. And now, sitting in the dark living room, he realized that there was no turning back. There is no way to fix everything. He was left alone with the consequences of his actions, and no one but himself was to blame for this. This emptiness became his only company. Jim realized that now he had to live with this burden, trying to somehow find meaning in a life that had collapsed. But this was a completely different life, full of regrets and losses, and he knew that he would never be able to return what he had lost. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one. Click to the next one.